Imagine the President of the United States dies tomorrow. You know exactly what happens next.
Yeah, vice president steps up.
Exactly. They take the oath, and the machinery of government just sort of keeps grinding along. It feels a bit like a highly choreographed relay race.
Right, a clean handoff.
Yeah, one runner finishes their leg, they hand the baton to the next person, and the race continues. It's expected. But what happens if the lead runner suddenly collapses, and when the cabinet frantically opens up the constitutional rulebook to figure out who's actually in charge?
Yeah, they realize with horror that the rule book is practically blank.
Yes.
I mean, you are looking at a recipe for absolute constitutional chaos. Without explicit instructions, every political faction starts, interpreting the silence to their own advantage.
Grabbing for the baton.
Grabbing from the baton and totally paralyzing the government.
And that muddy water, that exact crisis of succession, is what the United States plunged into in 1841. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're focusing on a man who is often, well, kind of dismissed by history as a joke or a trivia question.
They literally called him His Accidency.
Right. John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States. Our mission for you on this deep dive is to look at John Tyler's life and political career through a genuinely patriotic lens. We want to show how one man's unyielding, almost stubborn devotion to his interpretation of the Constitution set the vital precedent that shaped the American presidency forever.
And to give you the full picture of how he navigated this, we are pulling from a really substantial stack of sources today.
Yeah, it's a good stack.
We have detailed presidential biographies from the Miller Center and the Library of Virginia, historical records from the U.S. Senate, plus a fascinating legal document outlining the history of executive privilege.
Oh, and those historical notes on his family's estate.
Right, the estate notes. Those are incredible.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how John Tyler operated in the White House, we really have to look at the environment that forged him.
Absolutely.
He was born in 1790 at the Greenway Plantation in Virginia, and his father was this prominent revolutionary figure.
But not just a casual participant, right?
Yeah, exactly. His father actually opposed the U.S. Constitution at the Virginia Ratifying Convention.
What's fascinating here is that young John Tyler absorbed his father's political and economic views in toto.
Like, completely.
Completely. This wasn't just some political strategy he adopted to win elections later in life. He fundamentally believed that the national government was given way too much power at the expense of the states.
So, strict constructionism.
Yes. The idea that the federal government can only do exactly what is explicitly written in the Constitution and nothing more, that was his core identity.
And he was incredibly gifted at arguing those principles. I mean, he graduates from the College of William and Mary at age 17.
Wow.
By 21, he's sitting in the Virginia State Legislature. I look at this and I see the 19th century equivalent of like a 17-year-old tech prodigy.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. But instead of obsessively coding the next big app in a garage, Tyler was steeped in classical law and rigid ideological principles. He's brilliant, but he is completely uncompromising.
And that uncompromising nature makes his entry onto the national stage deeply ironic, because he ends up joining the Whig Party.
Which makes no sense.
None at all. The Whigs were essentially the party of a strong national bank and massive federal infrastructure projects.
They wanted a powerful, centralized economy.
Exactly. And Tyler despised all of those things.
So why join them?
He only joined their ranks because he believed President Andrew Jackson's use of executive power was increasingly tyrannical. He just wanted to oppose Jackson.
Which raises the obvious question for anyone listening. Why would the Whig Party put a fiercely independent ideologue who hates everything they stand for on their presidential ticket?
Pure politics.
By 1840, they nominate William Henry Harrison, right?
Yeah.
A military hero from the Battle of Tippecanoe, for president. But looking at the sources, the Whig leaders literally admitted their strategy was to, quote, fool the voters and avoid the issues.
Yeah, they just wanted to win.
And they needed a Southerner with a strong states' rights record to balance the ticket geographically and, draw those Southern votes.
They tossed Tyler onto the ticket simply for the slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Right, it sounded catchy.
Exactly. They fundamentally miscalculated the role of the vice presidency. In their minds, the vice president was just this non-entity who sat in the Senate, banged a gavel occasionally, and stayed entirely out of the way.
They treated him like a geographical prop, which feels like they were basically planting a ticking time bomb in the executive branch.
They really were.
And for exactly 30 days, everything went according to their cynical plan. Harrison is inaugurated on March 4th, 1841.
And then he gives that massive 90-minute inaugural address.
Out in the freezing cold, without a coat.
Yeah, bad idea.
He catches pneumonia. And just a month into his term, William Henry Harrison becomes the first chief executive to die in office.
And suddenly, that ticking time bomb detonates. The nation has never lost a president before.
It's uncharted territory.
Completely. When Harrison's cabinet frantically checks Article 2 of the Constitution, they find a dangerously vague clause. It simply stated that in the case of the president's death, the powers and duties of the office shall devolve on the vice president.
See, when I read that in the source, I asked myself, does the actual office of the presidency devolve onto him, making him the president, or do just the powers and duties transfer over, meaning he's like just a temporary caretaker?
That was the exact debate paralyzing Washington at that moment. Harrison's cabinet, led by Daniel Webster, who is a very powerful Secretary of State, they strongly preferred the caretaker interpretation.
Right, they wanted him on a leash.
Exactly. They wanted Tyler to be vice president, acting as president. They even attempted to box Tyler in by telling him that Harrison had operated by majority cabinet rule.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they claimed the cabinet voted on policies and the president was just one equal vote among many.
So they expected Tyler to just submit and be a weak, easily manipulated figurehead for their Whig agenda.
Yes, but Tyler's response is legendary.
It's so good.
He walks into that room and tells them, I am the president and I shall be held responsible for my administration. I can never consent to being dictated to.
He basically tells the cabinet, you can offer advice, but if you think you're running the country, I will gladly accept your resignations right now.
Right then and there. And to remove any shadow of a doubt, Tyler immediately finds a local judge and takes the formal presidential oath of office. He just forces the issue.
And as a minor, but kind of hilarious telling detail,
Yeah.
taking that official oath also bumped his salary.
Oh yeah, from the $5,000 a year vice presidential pay up to the full presidential salary of $25,000.
Nice little bonus there. But wait, I have to push back a bit here. Wasn't this just a massive power grab? I mean, he basically just declared himself president and forced everyone to go along with it because nobody had a better plan.
It definitely looks like a power grab on the surface,
Right.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the patriotic significance of Tyler forcing this issue is monumental. By stubbornly insisting he held the full office, Tyler established the vital precedent for an orderly transfer of power. Without Tyler laying down that marker, the executive branch could have fallen into utter paralysis or, full-blown succession crisis.
Like during the later sudden deaths of Lincoln or FDR or JFK.
Precisely. He locked in the stability of the presidency when the institution was at its absolute most vulnerable point.
Okay, so he secures the office and he establishes the precedent. But having established he is the president, he now actually has to govern against a Congress that realizes he won't be their puppet.
And it gets ugly.
This is a strict constructionist who accidentally became president for a Whig party that wants a massive centralized federal government.
It triggered total domestic warfare. The leader of the Whigs in the Senate was Henry Clay.
The Andrew Jackson of the Senate.
Right, that's what they called him, because he wanted the legislative branch to completely dominate the government. Clay assumed he could easily roll over Tyler, so he immediately pushes through a bill to create a new national bank.
And Tyler, staying incredibly true to his lifelong principles, vetoes his own party's bill because he feels it violates the Constitution.
Clay is furious. He tweaks the bill slightly and forces it through again.
And Tyler vetoes it a second time.
Yep. We get this dramatic showdown between the two men where Clay actually tries to physically intimidate and bully him.
But Tyler doesn't back down.
Not at all. Tyler just snaps back. Go you now then, Mr. Clay, to your end of the avenue where stands the Capitol. So help me God, I shall do mine at this end of it as I shall think proper.
That is such a mic drop moment.
It really is. And that exchange defined his administration. In September 1841, his entire cabinet, well, with the sole exception of Daniel Webster, resigned in a coordinated protest.
They're trying to force him to step down.
Exactly. And 2 days later, the Whigs officially expelled the sitting president of the United States from their party.
Unprecedented.
Protesters burned him in effigy outside the White House. Letters started arriving addressed to acting President Tyler, and Tyler simply returned them unopened.
He goes through 22 cabinet appointments during his term. He has 4 Supreme Court nominees outright rejected or completely ignored by the Senate. He is universally despised and isolated.
Truly alone.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Tyler figures out how to turn being a president without a party into a structural superpower.
A superpower.
Yeah, because without party loyalty tying him down, he owed nobody any political favors. He could rely entirely on his own interpretation of the Constitution.
And that total isolation is exactly what gave him the freedom to fiercely protect the executive branch from legislative overreach.
Right.
The legal document we reviewed on executive privilege gives us some vital examples of how he utilized this.
Yeah, the House of Representatives demanding applicant names.
Yes. They demanded the names of people applying for federal jobs, attempting to exert political pressure on the hiring process. Tyler flatly refused. He argued the appointment power rests with the president alone, and Congress has no constitutional right to demand applicant names.
And then there's the most pivotal example from that source, the Hitchcock investigation.
The Hitchcock report, yes.
The House demands these raw reports from a Colonel Hitchcock regarding alleged frauds committed against the Cherokee Indians. And Tyler says no, invoking the concept of executive privilege. But wait, help me out here. How is keeping a fraud investigation secret actually a defense of the Constitution?
That's the crucial point, because he wasn't withholding the reports to cover up crimes.
Okay.
Tyler argued that for a president to faithfully execute the laws, the executive branch must have the ability to conduct confidential internal investigations.
I see.
Right. If Congress could constantly demand all raw, unverified notes straight from the president's desk, the legislative branch would essentially turn the executive branch into a subordinate puppet.
They'd be micromanaging the presidency.
Exactly. So even though it subjected him to constant impeachment threats, Tyler was laying down the legal armor the presidency relies on today to maintain the separation of powers.
Because Congress completely blockaded him domestically, refusing to pass his initiatives, rejecting his nominees, Tyler realized the only way to exercise his presidential power was to look outward.
He had to pivot.
It's like being locked out of your own house by your roommates, so you decide to just go out and massively expand the yard instead.
That is a perfect analogy. He had to pivot to foreign policy because that is where the executive possesses far more unilateral control. And his record there is shockingly successful.
Because he didn't care about partisan victories anymore.
Right. He only cared about national expansion.
He negotiates the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which finally settles an extremely tense, long-standing border dispute with Canada. He formally extends the Monroe Doctrine to Hawaii, warning European powers to stay away. He secures the Treaty of Whangia, opening up massive new trade concessions with China.
He even manages to bring an end to the incredibly bloody Seminole War in Florida.
But his absolute top priority, like the defining goal of his later term, was the annexation of Texas.
Yes. Tyler saw adding Texas to the Union as his ticket to political redemption, a way to build a new coalition outside the Whigs and Democrats.
But integrating Texas was a total political minefield. Mexico was threatening war, and adding another slave state would completely upset the balance of power in Congress.
And his own Secretary of State, John C. Calhoun, basically bungled the initial effort.
Right, by linking it to slavery.
Yeah, Calhoun explicitly linked the annexation of Texas to the defense of slavery in his official messages to Congress, which instantly alienated every Northern senator.
So the Senate overwhelmingly rejects the initial treaty, which required a two-thirds majority.
But Tyler understood the mechanics of government better than his rivals. After he realized he had no shot at winning the 1844 election, he changed tactics.
He gets creative.
Very. He pushed for a joint resolution in Congress to annex Texas, which only required a simple majority in both houses instead of that impossible two-thirds Senate vote.
He fundamentally bypasses the treaty process and pulls it off. He signs the bill making Texas a state just 3 days before leaving office.
Talk about a buzzer beater.
Right. It was his final stubborn victory. But Congress couldn't let him leave without one last insult.
Of course not.
On his literal last day in office, they overrode his veto on a minor bill funding small revenue ships. It was the very first presidential veto override in American history.
So petty. But the sources also extensively detail the complex and tragic final chapter of his life, which really forces us to look at the consequences of his rigid ideology.
Yeah, the post-presidency.
During the rising tensions of the 1850s, Tyler was out of office. But when the secession crisis exploded in 1861, he actually chaired a peace conference in Washington, attempting to broker a compromise between the North and South to avert the Civil War.
When those compromise efforts failed and war became inevitable, Tyler voted for Virginia to secede from the Union.
He was even elected to the Confederate House of Representatives, though he died in early 1862 before he could take his seat.
It's quite a dark ending.
It is. His ultimate loyalty to his native Virginia over the Union really highlights the historical tragedy of his rigid states' rights philosophy. But the profound historical irony here is that the very man who ultimately sided with a rebellion based on states' rights had, during his presidency, taken the exact actions that strengthened and consolidated the very federal executive power he claimed to fear.
It is a massive walking contradiction. But beyond his complicated political legacy, there is a detail in the historical records regarding his family timeline that really grounds this history for me. It completely alters how we view the timeline of the United States.
Oh, the generational math regarding his descendants is just astounding.
For everyone listening, track this timeline. John Tyler, the 10th president, was born in 1790.
During George Washington's first term.
Exactly. Tyler had a son, Lyon Gardner Tyler, who was born very late in his life in 1853. And then Lyon had a son late in his life. That grandson's name was Harrison Ruffin Tyler.
And according to the historical records we reviewed, Harrison Ruffin Tyler died on May 25, 2025.
Wait, 2025?
Yes, at the age of 96.
Which means the period from the 10th president's birth to his last living grandchild's death spanned an unbelievable 235 years.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
3 generations stretching from the framing of the Constitution to the age of artificial intelligence. It genuinely shrinks the distance between us and the founding of the country.
It really does. And Harrison Tyler actually spent much of his life preserving the family's ancestral home, Sherwood Forest Plantation in Virginia.
I read about this.
Yeah, the house itself is a physical manifestation of this sprawling history. It features a 301-foot-long house, literally the exact length of a football field.
That's insane.
Making it the longest frame house in America. Tyler basically added colonnades and ballrooms to connect various outbuildings so he could have just one continuous structure.
Wow. And this raises an important question, doesn't it? We tend to view the 1840s as ancient, dusty history. We picture black and white photographs and people in top hats.
Right.
But how does our proximity to history change when we realize that the political battles of the 1840s are literally only 2 overlapping lifetimes away?
We are far closer to the consequences of these events than we usually think. The institutional structures Tyler fought for are the exact same structures governing us right now.
So what does this all mean for you listening today? Why should you care about a stubborn president from the 1840s? Think about the next time you step into a voting booth to cast a ballot in a presidential election. When you vote for a vice presidential candidate today, you are casting a vote for someone who holds the absolute, unshakable right to become the president of the United States if tragedy strikes. That weight, that institutional stability, exists for you entirely because John Tyler forced that reality into existence.
He was an imperfect man, without a doubt, and his final days cast a dark shadow over his legacy.
Yeah.
But his patriotic stubbornness protected the executive branch from being devoured by Congress. It expanded the map of the nation, and it cemented the rules of presidential succession.
Sometimes being entirely unyielding in the face of massive unpopularity is exactly what the structural integrity of a republic requires.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us with one final thought to mull over. We place so much faith in the written text of our governing documents.
Yeah.
But if the U.S. Constitution was so dangerously vague about the transfer of its highest office, to the point where an unwritten norm and a stubborn personality had to save the system from collapse,
Yeah.
how much of our modern democracy actually relies on ironclad written laws versus just the collective fragile agreement of the people currently sitting in the room? Think about that. We'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.